I want you to understand something before we get into the details of what is happening on the ground right now. What you are watching in the Persian Gulf is not a war that was forced upon the United States. It is not a war of necessity. It is not a war of last resort. It is a war of choice, made by men who have never worn a uniform, who have never sat in a forward operating base listening to incoming fire, who have never had to write a letter to the mother of a soldier who died carrying out their instructions. And it is a war being conducted with a level of strategic incoherence that, in my decades of experience studying military history and American foreign policy, I have rarely seen matched. Day 4 of this conflict has arrived, and the picture that is emerging on the ground is exactly the picture that anyone with honest military judgment would have predicted from the beginning. Not the picture of a clean, decisive 4-week campaign, the picture of a rapidly widening, regionally metastasizing conflict with no clear military logic, no achievable political endpoint, and a human and economic cost that is already spiraling beyond anything the architects of this operation publicly anticipated. Let me start with the nuclear question, because this is the stated justification for everything that has happened. The entire premise of Operation Epic Fury, as Trump and Netanyahu presented it to the American and Israeli publics, was that Iran was on the verge of acquiring a nuclear weapon, and that military action was the only remaining option to prevent it. That premise has now been exposed on day 4 of the conflict as factually incorrect. The International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed that it has no indication that any of Iran's nuclear installations were hit or significantly damaged in the strikes. The Natanz facility has sustained some damage to its entrance areas, but the core enrichment infrastructure, the centrifuge halls, the underground processing facilities, the technical knowledge base, the engineering expertise, none of it has been eliminated. The House of Commons Library, drawing on independent military assessment, confirms that approximately 2,000 strikes have been conducted by the United States and Israel combined, and the nuclear program remains essentially intact. 2,000 strikes, the largest aerial bombardment campaign since the opening phase of the Iraq War, and the stated primary military objective has not been achieved. What does that tell you? It tells you that either the people who planned this operation were dishonest about the feasibility of the nuclear objective from the beginning, or they were catastrophically incompetent in their targeting. Either explanation is damning. Neither is acceptable. Now let us look at what is actually happening on the battlefield, because the battlefield reality is revealing truths about modern warfare and American military power that the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office would prefer you did not examine too closely. Iran has launched attacks on 27 American military bases across the region. Kuwait alone has intercepted 178 ballistic missiles and 384 drones directed at its territory since this conflict began 4 days ago. The UAE has intercepted 169 missiles out of 182 detected. The United States Embassy in Saudi Arabia has been struck by Iranian drones, with additional drones hitting at or near the compound. The U.S. Embassy, in the capital city of America's most important regional ally. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps then stated openly on Telegram that it had begun operations to destroy American political centers across the region. That is not the behavior of a military that is being suppressed and degraded. That is the behavior of a military that is executing a pre-planned, multi-domain, distributed retaliatory campaign with a coherence and operational tempo that should give every honest military analyst serious pause. 3 American F-15E Strike Eagles have been shot down over Kuwait. Shot down, not crashed due to mechanical failure. Shot down by Kuwaiti air defense systems that apparently engaged them by mistake. Let me be direct about what that incident reveals, because it is being minimized in the American press in a way that is deeply dishonest. When friendly fire air defense engagements are occurring on day 3 of a conflict, it tells you that the coordination architecture between American forces and allied air defense networks in the Gulf is inadequate for the operational tempo and complexity of this fight. It tells you that the command and control picture across multiple countries and multiple air defense systems is not sufficiently integrated to prevent fratricidal engagements. And it tells you that as this conflict intensifies, As more missiles and drones fill the airspace over the Gulf simultaneously, that problem is going to get worse before it gets better. Now, I want to address the ground dimension of this conflict, because there is a ground dimension and Washington is not being honest about it. Israeli special forces, including Mossad operatives, have reportedly conducted ground operations inside Iran. Israel's defense minister has authorized a ground invasion of Lebanon. The Israeli Defense Forces have announced the destruction of Iran's Supreme National Security Council headquarters, the President's office, and command and control infrastructure across Tehran. And Netanyahu is simultaneously going on Fox News and telling Sean Hannity that this is not an endless war and that it will usher in an era of peace. That kind of statement, made on day 4 of a conflict that is already spanning 9 countries, that has already opened 2 simultaneous fronts, that has already killed 6 American soldiers, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs explicitly warning that more losses should be expected, that kind of statement is not strategic communication. It is the political theater of a man who is gambling with other people's lives and hoping the audience does not notice the dice are loaded. Let me talk about the Israeli strategic objective, because I think the American public deserves an honest assessment of what Israel actually wants from this conflict, and it is not what Netanyahu is saying publicly. A former Israeli government advisor speaking to Al Jazeera put it with a clarity that official Israeli communications deliberately avoid. Israel's actual goal is not smooth regime change. Israel's goal is regime and state collapse, not a different government in Tehran, a broken state, a fragmented country, an Iran that is incapable of projecting military power, incapable of funding proxies, incapable of threatening Israel's regional dominance for a generation. That is the actual objective, and I want you to think carefully about what that objective implies for the United States, because achieving state collapse in a nation of 90 million people, with a highly educated population, a deeply rooted institutional culture, and a military and security apparatus that has been preparing for exactly this moment for 3 decades, is not a 4-week air campaign. It is a generational project. It is Iraq times 10. It is the kind of strategic commitment that would require American blood and treasure on a scale that no one in Washington is being honest with the American people about. Look at what has already happened to Iran's cultural heritage. The Golestan Palace, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a structure that has stood since the Qajar era, that survived 2 world wars, that survived the Islamic Revolution, has been damaged in American and Israeli strikes. When you start destroying UNESCO World Heritage Sites, when you start striking the state broadcaster, when you start systematically dismantling the symbolic infrastructure of a civilization, you are not conducting a targeted military campaign against a nuclear program. You are conducting collective punishment against an entire nation. And collective punishment, whatever the political context, whatever the strategic justification offered, has a documented historical track record of hardening resistance rather than breaking it. The German bombing of London did not break British resolve. The American bombing of North Vietnam did not break North Vietnamese resolve. The collective punishment of civilian populations and their cultural heritage does not produce political capitulation. It produces generational hatred. And generational hatred produces the insurgencies and the proxy conflicts and the terrorist organizations that American soldiers will be fighting for the next 30 years. I want to spend some time on the Lebanese front because I think it is being dangerously underreported relative to its strategic significance. Hezbollah has entered this war. Israel has authorized a ground invasion of Lebanon. The IDF is conducting simultaneous bombing campaigns in Tehran and Beirut. Israeli military officials are issuing evacuation orders for neighborhoods in southern Beirut ahead of imminent operations. What we are watching is the opening of a 2-front war for Israel simultaneously, with a military that is already operating at 70,000 reservists mobilized, that is defending its own cities from Iranian ballistic missiles, and that is now being asked to conduct a ground invasion of Lebanon at the same time. The Israeli military is a formidable force, but it is not an infinite force. And the doctrine of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously against enemies who have specifically designed their military strategies around the concept of multi-front saturation is a doctrine that has historically exhausted armies, far more powerful than the IDF,